Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that you might not think about too much in your daily life, but something that is really secretly behind some amazing feats of human achievement. And that is the checklist.
Checklists,
Yeah,
really? Like what I use for grocery shopping.
exactly. I bet you've got one on your fridge right now. But get this. The sources you sent me for this episode talk about how checklists are used by experts, like in fields like surgery, aviation, and finance. I mean, we're talking about these high-stakes, super complex situations where even tiny mistakes can be disastrous.
That's right. It is pretty fascinating how something so simple can be so powerful.
Yeah. So let's unpack this a little bit. Why are experts in these incredibly complex fields relying on checklists? And what can we learn from them to maybe improve our own performance in our lives?
Well, it all starts with the fact that, we live in a world of extreme complexity these days. I mean, think about it. In the past, the main obstacle to solving problems was often just a lack of knowledge. We just didn't know enough to solve certain
Yeah,
problems.
yeah.
But today, we've amassed so much knowledge in fields like medicine and engineering that the knowledge itself has become a challenge to manage. To illustrate this, let's just imagine a scenario from one of the sources. A child who nearly drowned is brought to the hospital.
Okay, okay. I can picture that, yeah.
Yeah,
Really scary.
absolutely. Now, decades ago, there might not have been much that doctors could have done for a child in that situation. But today, with all of our medical advances, there's a real chance to save that child's life. But here's the thing. Rescuing a drowning victim involves a huge team of specialists from, paramedics to surgeons to the folks running life support machines and on and on.
Wow, so many moving parts.
Right. Each person has their own crucial role, and they all have to work together flawlessly. There's just so much potential for things to go wrong, especially under that kind of pressure.
So in this scenario, where do checklists come in?
Well, they act as a kind of cognitive safety net. But, before we dive into how they work, I bet you're wondering if all of this is way too complex and nuanced for simple checklists.
Well, to be honest, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Like my work involves a lot of creativity and problem solving. It's not like I'm just following a recipe, you know what I mean?
Right, right. That's a pretty common misconception. But research shows that even the most brilliant minds out there can benefit from checklists. They help us overcome our human limitations. Even experts get tired or stressed, and those are exactly the times when we're most likely to forget things or make mistakes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know I'm not at my best when I'm feeling frazzled, that's for sure.
Right. So checklists can help us be more consistent, more disciplined. They prevent us from skipping steps even when we're tempted to cut corners. And they're especially helpful for promoting teamwork and communication, which is absolutely vital in these complex environments we were just talking about.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic behind checklists, but I'm ready for some real-world examples here. Where should we start?
How about a little trip back in time to the world of aviation, specifically the 1930s? The Boeing Model 299 bomber, the precursor to the famous B-17, was causing a lot of concern back then.
The B-17, that iconic World War II bomber. What was the problem with it?
Well, during a test flight, one of the prototypes crashed and two crew members were killed. And the reason was that it was considered too much airplane for one person to fly.
Wow, that's interesting. I always imagined those early pilots as being these, super skilled daredevils.
Yeah,
But I guess even they had their limits.
exactly. This plane was so complex with its four engines and all of these brand new systems that pilots were getting overwhelmed. They tried more training, but it wasn't enough.
So how did they solve this? Did they redesign the plane?
Instead of going back to the drawing board, a group of test pilots came up with a surprisingly simple solution: the pilot's checklists.
A checklist.
Yeah.
Really, it sounds almost too simple to be effective.
I know, right? But this checklist was revolutionary. It acknowledged that even the most skilled pilots couldn't rely on memory alone when dealing with such a complex machine. It became their external brain, making sure they didn't miss any critical steps during takeoff, flight, or landing.
So the checklist helped pilots manage the cognitive load, like an early version of a flight computer almost.
Precisely. And it worked. The checklist tamed the complexity of the Model 299, which paved the way for its eventual success as the B-17. And this really marked the beginning of checklists in aviation. They evolved alongside planes, becoming even more crucial as technology advanced.
Speaking of evolution, is it true that Boeing actually has a checklist factory?
That's right. They have a dedicated team whose sole job is to develop and refine checklists for all their aircraft.
That's wild. What exactly do these checklist gurus do?
Well, they're constantly observing pilots in simulators, analyzing their actions, and timing them on all sorts of tasks. Their goal is to create checklists that are as concise and efficient as possible, highlighting only the most crucial steps.
So it's not about spelling out every single detail, but about providing reminders of the things that even really skilled professionals might overlook under pressure.
Exactly. And these checklists cover a huge range of scenarios, from routine pre-flight checks to emergency procedures for things like engine failure or even a cargo door malfunction.
Speaking of cargo doors, I remember reading about a terrifying incident where a cargo door blew out on a 747. I was in a flight simulator once, and we actually practiced the procedure for handling a cargo door blowout. Even in the simulation, it was intense.
Oh, I can imagine. So you've experienced firsthand how a well-designed checklist can bring a sense of control in a chaotic situation.
Yeah.
It's not just about aviation, though. Another field that might surprise you with its use of checklists is construction.
Construction.
Mm,
Really, that's not something I'd immediately associate with checklists.
I know, it does seem a bit surprising. But construction projects are incredibly complex with tons of moving parts. Just like medicine, a single error can have devastating consequences.
Yeah. I actually had an experience in a building where the floors were noticeably uneven, and it turned out that there had been some mistakes during construction. Made me wonder about the importance of getting things right the first time.
That's a great example. Seemingly small oversights can have huge consequences down the line. And checklists in construction help to ensure that each stage of the project, from design to execution, is carefully reviewed. They make sure that materials meet standards, potential hazards are addressed, and that everyone's on the same page.
Okay, I get it. But do construction workers actually walk around with clipboards, ticking off boxes? How do they use checklists in practice?
It's more integrated than that. Let me give you an example. The Citicorp building in Manhattan, a stunning skyscraper with a unique slanted roof, presented some serious engineering challenges.
A slanted roof on a skyscraper. Sounds risky.
It was. Wind tunnel tests showed that the building was vulnerable to strong winds, and the lead structural engineer had to devise this really complex solution, and checklists were crucial to make sure that everyone involved, from architects to the construction crews, were all on the same page.
So the checklist helped prevent a potential disaster in this case.
That's right. The checklist ensured that even a seemingly minor detail, like the type of joints used in the building supports, was properly reviewed. Years later, it was discovered that a change from welded joints to bolted joints had actually created a serious weakness in the building.
Wow, so they dodged a bullet thanks to the checklist.
They did. It highlights how crucial these checks and balances are, even in fields we think of as being well-established and safe.
Yeah.
Now, you might be thinking that checklists are great for these really concrete step-by-step processes, but what about fields that rely more on intuition and judgment? Like finance, for example.
That's exactly what I was wondering. I always pictured investors as more like, maverick types relying on gut feelings.
Right, it's a common perception. But actually, even successful investors are turning to checklists.
Seriously. So Wall Street is embracing the power of the checklist.
They are. We've got examples of major investors like Monish Pabrai, who manages a huge portfolio, and Guy Speier, who runs a successful fund in Zurich, both relying on checklists. They use them to analyze companies, identify potential risks, and avoid emotional biases.
So it's like having a system to double-check those gut feelings and make sure they're based on solid reasoning.
Precisely. These investors have seen huge improvements in the speed and accuracy of their decisions. They're basically forcing themselves to ask the tough questions, even when things seem like a sure bet.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this applies to more than just physical tasks. It's about managing complexity in any field, even the world of high finance. But can we get a little more specific? What kinds of things are actually on these financial checklists?
Well, for example, Monish Pabrai realized that companies might inflate their earnings during economic booms or, understate them during busts, which could mislead investors. So he added a specific checkpoint to his checklist. Stop and confirm that you've considered whether the revenues might be overstated or understated.
That's fascinating. It's like a built-in safeguard against getting swept up in the hype.
Right. And it's not just about spotting potential problems. One investor we read about, who prefers to stay anonymous, developed a really detailed checklist to address potential errors at every stage of the investment process. He even has a day 3 checklist to decide if an investment is even worth pursuing further.
A day 3 checklist. That sounds incredibly thorough.
It is, and it's all about being systematic and avoiding those impulsive decisions. He found that after implementing the checklist, he and his team were much more objective and efficient in their analysis. They made better decisions faster.
That's impressive. It really challenges the idea that checklists stifle creativity or intuition. It seems like they actually free up mental space for more thoughtful decision-making.
Absolutely. And it's not just him. Guy Spire, after adopting a checklist-driven approach, found that he could handle all the analysis himself without even needing to hire an analyst.
Wow, that's amazing. So we've seen how checklists work in aviation, construction, and even finance. It's clear they're not just about remembering groceries or packing your bags, but I'm guessing you saved the most compelling example for last. The story of U.S. Airways Flight 1539, the miracle on the Hudson.
You know me too well. That story perfectly illustrates how discipline, teamwork, and yes, checklists can be just as important as individual heroism. Yeah, Miracle on the Hudson definitely comes to mind. You know, that image of the plane just floating in the river. Unforgettable.
It really is, yeah. But how do checklists fit into this story? I'm curious.
This event really challenges, I think, this whole idea of the lone hero. You know, while Captain Sullenberger, Sully, was undeniably incredibly skilled, the successful landing wasn't just about him. It was a testament to the entire crew's discipline, their teamwork, and yes, their reliance on checklists.
Okay, you've got my attention. Take me back to that day. What happened?
All right, so picture this. It's January 2009, cold afternoon in New York City. Flight 1549 takes off from LaGuardia, and shortly after, boom, the plane hits a flock of geese.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Both engines lose power. They're gliding over one of the most densely populated areas in the entire world, and they need to land fast.
Oh, man. That's the stuff of nightmares. What did they do?
Here's where the training and preparation kick in. Sullenberger and his co-pilot Jeffrey Skiles, they didn't panic. They immediately started working through the emergency checklist, just like they had practiced countless times before.
So even in that moment of absolute terror, they turned to the checklist.
They did, because they knew that panicking or trying to improvise without a plan would have been disastrous. The checklist helped them stay focused, prioritize tasks, and make really clear decisions under immense pressure.
It's kind of mind-blowing that something as simple as a checklist could have such a huge impact in a life or death situation like that.
And here's something even more incredible. This was a brand new crew. Sullenberger and Skiles had never even flown together before that day.
Whoa, seriously? They were basically strangers working together in a crisis.
Yes, but because they both understood the importance of procedures and clear communication, elements that are really reinforced by those checklists, they were able to function as a seamless team.
That's the power of a shared system, right? Even when you're working with people you don't know very well.
Exactly. It's not just about individual brilliance. It's about having the discipline to follow those procedures, working as a team, and being prepared for the unexpected.
And those are all qualities that, we can all cultivate, regardless of what our profession is.
Absolutely. Now, you might be thinking, okay, checklists are great for pilots and astronauts and things like that, but I'm a surgeon. This is where your personal journey with checklists began, right?
It is, and I have to admit, I was initially pretty skeptical too. I mean, surgery is such a highly skilled profession. I didn't really see how a simple checklist could really make a difference in such a complex field.
Yeah, it's a common reaction. So you thought of surgery as more of an art, relying on experience and intuition. So what changed your mind?
What was while I was working with the World Health Organization on this project to improve surgical safety globally, what we discovered was pretty shocking, actually.
Oh, fill me in. What did you find?
Well, we were analyzing data from hospitals all over the world, and what we discovered was that surgery was far riskier than a lot of people realize. Millions of people were experiencing complications, even dying, from completely preventable errors. And this wasn't just happening in under-resourced hospitals either, it was happening everywhere.
Wow, that's a sobering thought. Even in the most advanced healthcare systems, things can still go wrong.
Exactly. And what really surprised us was that a lot of these errors were rooted in failures of communication, teamwork, or just basic safety procedures. Sounds familiar, right?
Definitely. We've seen this pattern in aviation and construction, too. It's a human factor.
Right. And that's when we started thinking, could checklists help to improve surgical safety, too?
That's a pretty bold idea. But how do you even begin to create a checklist for something as intricate as surgery?
We decided to focus on the most common and the most preventable errors. Things like making sure that the patient received the right antibiotics before surgery, verifying the correct surgical site, and ensuring that all surgical instruments were accounted for.
Those sound like pretty basic things. You'd think experienced surgeons wouldn't need reminders for things like that.
You'd think so, right? But we found that even the most seasoned surgical teams would occasionally miss these really crucial steps. Distractions, fatigue, pressure, it happens.
Yeah. So you developed a checklist specifically to address these basic safety steps.
We did, and to really put it to the test, we implemented it in 8 hospitals across very different settings, from really high-income countries like the US and the UK to low-income countries like Tanzania and India.
Wow, a truly global trial. What happened?
The results were pretty astounding. After implementing the checklist, the rate of major complications dropped by 36%, and deaths decreased by an incredible 47%.
Wow. A simple checklist had that much of an impact.
It did, and it worked regardless of the hospital's location or their resources. It was about having a system in place to make sure that those basic but absolutely vital safety steps weren't overlooked.
So it wasn't just about fancy technology or experience. It was about having that safety net. What exactly did this checklist look like?
Well, we focused on 3 main phases of surgery. So before anesthesia, the checklist prompted the team to confirm the patient's identity, the procedure, and the surgical site. It also made sure that all the equipment and supplies were ready to go.
Okay, that makes sense. But were these really things that needed to be spelled out?
You'd be surprised how often those seemingly obvious things get missed. I mean, there have been cases of surgery being performed on the wrong patient, or even the wrong body part, simply because someone didn't double check.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. It's a stark reminder that anyone can make a mistake, and having these checks in place is absolutely crucial. So what about the other phases of surgery?
Right, so before the incision, the checklist prompted the team to discuss potential risks and complications, and to make sure the surgical site was properly marked and prepped.
So it's not just about these technical checks, but also about communication and making sure everyone is truly on the same page before things get started.
Exactly. We wanted to create this moment where the entire team, from the surgeon to the nurses to the anesthesiologist, could pause, confirm that they were all ready, and address any concerns.
I like that. A moment of collective focus before, the really critical moment.
Exactly. We call it the timeout. All activity would literally stop, and the team would just focus solely on running through this checklist. It might seem like a small thing, but it made a big difference for teamwork and communication.
I bet. So what about the last phase, after the surgery is finished?
Right. So before the patient even leaves the operating room, the checklist prompts the team to make sure that all instruments and sponges are accounted for, the surgical site is closed properly, and any necessary follow-up care is arranged.
So you're catching any potential issues before they become, bigger problems down the line.
Exactly. You wouldn't believe how often surgical instruments get left inside patients.
I can only imagine. That sounds like a nightmare scenario. So you had these 3 critical checkpoints built right into the surgical workflow. Did you run into any resistance when you were implementing this new system?
Oh, absolutely. There was a lot of initial skepticism. Some surgeons felt insulted, like we were treating them like beginners who needed to be reminded to wash their hands.
I can understand that reaction. I mean, it is a big change, going from a culture of individual autonomy to one where everyone is accountable to a shared set of procedures.
It is. But it's important to remember that checklists aren't meant to replace expertise or judgment. They're about enhancing those qualities and creating a system for consistency and safety. It's kind of like the difference between a jazz musician and an orchestra. The jazz musician can improvise, but an orchestra needs a conductor and a score to create harmony.
That's a brilliant analogy. And in this case, the checklist is both the conductor and the score, making sure everyone is in sync. But how did you convince those skeptical surgeons to get on board?
Well, the data was definitely persuasive. Seeing that dramatic reduction in complications and deaths, that was pretty hard to argue with. But it was also about addressing their concerns. We really emphasized that the checklist wasn't meant to be this rigid or bureaucratic thing.
So it wasn't about dictating every single move, but about empowering the entire team to work together more effectively.
Exactly. We encourage teams to adapt the checklist to their specific needs and workflow. The key was making it a collaborative process, not something imposed from above.
So it's about building a culture of teamwork and open communication where everyone feels comfortable speaking up.
Precisely. And that kind of environment ultimately benefits everyone, the surgical team, the hospital, and most importantly, the patients.
Absolutely. When safety and teamwork are the priorities, everyone wins. But let's zoom out for a second. We've seen how checklists are transforming these really complex professional fields. But how can the rest of us who aren't pilots or surgeons or anything apply these principles to our own lives and work?
That's a great question. The key is recognizing that checklists aren't just for experts or for, life or death situations. They can be incredibly helpful for anyone who wants to improve their performance, reduce errors, and just, get things done better.
Okay, I'm all ears. Where do I start?
Well, think about the tasks or projects that consistently trip you up. The areas where you feel overwhelmed or like you're constantly playing catch up.
You know what? You're right. I have this terrible habit of procrastinating, especially with big, complex projects. I often get stuck in the planning phase and then scramble to finish everything at the last minute.
That's a perfect example. A checklist could really help you break down those big projects into smaller, more manageable steps. It's like having your own personal project manager.
I like the sound of that. But how do I actually create a checklist that works for me?
It doesn't have to be complicated. First, identify the key steps involved in that task or project. Then, break those steps down into smaller, even more actionable items.
So, like a to-do list on steroids.
Exactly. And don't forget to be self-aware. Think about the mistakes or oversights that you're most prone to and create specific checks to address those weaknesses.
So it's about being honest with myself about where I tend to mess up. I like it.
And remember, what works for one person might not work for another. Experiment. Find a format and a process that feels natural and helpful for you.
Got it. So there's no one-size-fits-all checklist.
Right. We talked about different types of checklists earlier, like do, confirm, and redo. It's all about finding your own checklist style. And remember, checklists aren't static either. They should be constantly evolving as you learn and grow.
So it's a journey of continuous improvement, just like in those professional fields that we were talking about. But what about those times when there is no clear roadmap? When you have to think on your feet and make decisions in the moment?
That's a great point. True expertise is about knowing when to stick to the checklist and when to deviate from it. It's about finding that balance between discipline and flexibility.
It's like being a jazz musician again. They have this deep understanding of music theory, but they also know how to improvise.
Exactly. And in a sense, we all need to be jazz musicians in our own lives, able to follow the score, but also improvise when necessary.
I love that analogy. So checklists don't actually stifle creativity or innovation. They kind of enhance them by providing a foundation of structure and discipline.
Right. They free up our mental energy so we can focus on the things that truly matter, the things that require our unique skills and insights.
This has been so insightful. I'm already starting to see checklists in a whole new light. They're not just about remembering to buy milk, but about, tackling complexity and achieving excellence in any area of life.
I'm so glad to hear that. And that brings us to a key aspect of checklists that we haven't really touched on yet, which is their power to help us reclaim a sense of focus and mindfulness in a world that is just absolutely overflowing with distractions.
Ooh, that sounds right up my alley. Tell me more.
Think about it this way. We're constantly bombarded with distractions these days, emails, messages, notifications. It's a never-ending stream of information coming at us.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah. I feel like I'm constantly switching between tasks and never fully focusing on any one thing.
Exactly, and that's where checklists can really come in handy. They kind of force us to slow down, to be more intentional with our time and energy.
So it's like a shield against that, the digital deluge almost.
That's a great way to put it. When we use a checklist, we're basically creating this mental space where we can shut out all that noise and really concentrate on what's important.
It makes me think of those mindfulness exercises where you focus on your breath or, a single object just to kind of clear your mind.
Yeah, I see the connection there. Checklists provide that same kind of focus, but in a much more practical, task-oriented way.
So it's like mindfulness for getting things done.
Exactly. And I think that's especially valuable in our, always-on, hyper-connected world.
Yeah. It's a way to reclaim a sense of control and purpose amidst all that chaos.
Right. And, as we've seen, checklists aren't just about preventing those errors or improving efficiency. They can actually help us bridge the gap between knowledge and action.
Okay. I'm curious about that. What do you mean?
Well, we live in an age of information overload, right?
Mhm.
I mean, we have access to more knowledge than ever before, but it doesn't always translate into effective action.
Yeah, it's like that saying, knowledge is power, but only if you use it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can read all the books and articles in the world, but if we don't have a system for actually applying that knowledge, it's basically useless.
So checklists provide that system. They help us move from knowing to doing.
Precisely. They take all that abstract information and break it down into concrete, actionable steps.
It's like having a recipe for success.
Right. It's like those complicated Lego sets. You might have all the pieces, but without the instructions, you'd be completely lost.
Oh, that's a great analogy. We're all trying to build something with the knowledge and experience that we accumulate, and checklists are kind of like the instruction manuals that guide us through that process.
Okay, but what about those situations where there are no clear instructions? What about those times when we have to improvise, think on our feet?
Well, that's where true expertise comes in, right? I mean, it's not just about following rules blindly. It's about knowing when to break the rules, when to deviate from the checklist.
So it's about finding the right balance between discipline and flexibility.
Exactly. And checklists can actually help us develop that balance by providing a framework for the routine and the predictable aspects of our work. They free up our mental energy to deal with the unexpected.
This reminds me of those jazz musicians we were talking about earlier. They have this really deep understanding of music theory, but they also know how to improvise and create something totally new within that structure.
That's a perfect example. We all need to be a bit like jazz musicians, able to follow the score when necessary, but also, ready to riff and solo when the moment calls for it.
So checklists don't actually limit our creativity. They enhance it by giving us that solid foundation to build on.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm like starting to see checklists everywhere now.
Me too. But before we wrap up, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on some common misconceptions about checklists. What are some things that you think people get wrong about them?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that checklists are all about, rote memorization or blindly following instructions.
Like, there's some kind of robotic script that eliminates the need for thinking altogether.
Right. A good checklist isn't about mindlessly checking boxes. It's about engaging your brain and prompting you to think critically and adapt to the situation at hand.
So it's a tool for thinking, not just for doing.
Exactly. Another common pitfall is creating checklists that are just way too long or too complex. If a checklist feels overwhelming, people are just more likely to ignore it.
It's like trying to assemble a 1,000-piece Lego set without sorting the pieces first. You just give up.
Right. The most effective checklists are concise, clear, and focused on the most essential steps.
It's about finding that sweet spot between providing enough guidance and avoiding information overload.
Right. And finally, it's important to remember that checklists aren't a magic solution. They're not going to solve every problem or make us infallible.
They're tools, not silver bullets.
Exactly. They're most effective when they're part of a larger culture of, safety, teamwork, and continuous improvement.
So it's not just about having the checklist. It's about having the right mindset and the systems in place to support its use.
Well said.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive, from aviation to surgery to finance, and even to our own personal lives. We've seen how checklists can be these really powerful tools for achieving success and avoiding those really costly mistakes.
It's been a fascinating journey. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the humble checklist.
Me too. And to our listeners, we encourage you to consider how checklists might transform your own work or life. What seemingly simple but crucial steps might you be overlooking? Could a checklist be the key to unlocking greater efficiency, reducing stress, and just achieving better outcomes in everything that you do?
That's something worth thinking about.
It is. So until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep checking those lists.